Welcome to today's deep dive. If you're joining us right now, whether you're prepping for a marathon meeting, or maybe you're just catching up on the latest cultural shifts, or you're just insanely curious about the ideological fault lines in our society, we are absolutely thrilled to have you here.
Yeah, we really are. It's a big one today.
It really is. And before we jump into anything else, please take a second right now to just like and subscribe to the show. It's the absolute best way to support this kind of in-depth analysis and ensure we can keep bringing these comprehensive, unfiltered deep dives directly to you.
Right. It really does make a massive difference for us, and we appreciate every single one of you who takes the time to do it. So thank you.
Definitely. So today our mission is to review a newly published, incredibly dense, and highly provocative ebook. I want to set your expectations right out of the gate here. Whether you're deeply embedded in the manosphere or whether you're simply curious about the escalating cultural friction between men and women, or you're actively looking to understand the ideological frameworks of modern men's rights activists, this text offers a completely unfiltered look into that specific worldview.
Unfiltered is probably an understatement.
Yeah, truly. We are diving into a book titled Feminist Logic Bombs Suffragette Terrorism, Epistemic Violence, Misandry Without Borders, Satanic Conversions, and Ideological Negative Animus Possession. It's written by Conrad Riker, and it was published and copyrighted in 2025.
It is quite a title, to say the least, and honestly, it sets the stage perfectly for exactly the kind of intensive, unvarnished, and heavily academic rhetoric that you're going to find inside the pages. I mean, Riker does not hold back, and he is clearly not interested in softening his blows for a mainstream audience.
Not even a little bit. Now, I need to make something crystal clear to you right at the top of this deep dive. The material we're covering today is highly politically charged. It touches on the absolute most sensitive nerves of modern culture, gender dynamics, and institutional power.
Yeah, the third rail stuff.
Exactly. So we are not taking sides here. Let me repeat that. We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we here to condemn them. Our goal with this deep dive is to impartially report, unpack, and synthesize the arguments contained in this source material. We want to help you understand the history and the current state of our institutions, like the family courts, corporate HR departments, the media, and the education system through the highly specific lens of this author. Riker argues these institutions have been entirely captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies, and we're going to look at exactly how he builds that case.
That is exactly right. Our role today is strictly to act as your guides through a very complex, very polarizing text. We're mapping out Riker's intellectual and ideological architecture. We want you to understand the mechanics of his argument so that when you encounter these ideas out in the wild, and you will, because this movement is growing rapidly, you understand the foundational logic behind them.
Right, and I highly encourage you to read the source material for yourself. If you want to explore these arguments further and really hook into the raw text, you can buy the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. The author also explicitly instructs readers to follow him at Conrad Mark Riker on Substack for ongoing essays and updates.
Highly recommend checking those out if you want the primary source.
So here's our roadmap for the journey today. We're going to start by exploring the core premise of the book, which involves the concept of satanic conversion. From there, we'll unpack what he calls the maternal archetype hijack, analyze his brutal economic concept of the consumer queen, dive into the weaponization of the legal system, and finally, look at his proposed classical solutions to what he views as an absolute civilizational crisis.
It's a massive undertaking, so we should probably just dive right into the deep end. When I first opened this book, I expected a standard political critique of modern feminism. Maybe some arguments about the wage gap or workplace policies. But Riker completely bypasses the whole equality debate entirely. He frames the entire modern feminist movement as a severe pathology.
That was the first major shock of the text for me. He fundamentally redefines modern feminism right out of the gate. He rejects the mainstream dictionary definition of feminism as a movement for social and economic equality. In his framework, feminism is characterized explicitly as a religion of female supremacy.
Right, he doesn't see it as a political movement at all.
Exactly. But he goes even deeper into the psychology of it, describing the movement as a psychological immune response. His premise is that women who have rejected their biological destiny, specifically motherhood and traditional family structures, are experiencing a profound internal crisis. And this movement is their coping mechanism.
He essentially calls it a mass delusion born of arrested development. Riker argues that modern culture has encouraged women to refuse to grow up, to refuse to take genuine responsibility for their own happiness, and to avoid confronting the emptiness that comes from rejecting biological norms. So instead of looking inward, he claims they project all of that internal chaos outward, blaming men for their deep-seated unhappiness. And this psychological framing leads us directly into one of the most recurring philosophical themes in the entire book, which is the concept of satanic inversion.
Let's spend some real time on this, because satanic inversion sounds like a phrase out of a horror movie. But he's using it in a very specific structural way. He doesn't mean it in a literal demonic ritual sense. He's using it as a philosophical descriptor for a society that has lost its mind.
It's a structural flipping of reality.
Exactly. He argues that our modern institutions have completely flipped morality, logic, and natural law upside down. In this inverted reality, things that were historically considered good and virtuous are now treated as evil. Personal responsibility is labeled as systemic oppression. And traditional male attributes like stoicism, physical strength, protectiveness, and the desire to lead are literally classified by the psychological establishment as a disease or just outright toxic.
It's a total reversal of the poles. In an inverted system, the victim is the aggressor and the aggressor is the victim. Riker believes that we are living in a society where the truth is not just ignored, it is actively punished, while delusion is subsidized and celebrated.
He provides a really illustrative anecdote to anchor this point and show how this inversion operates in the real world. He talks about a specific legal case involving a Swedish father. According to the text, this father was fined 10,000 kroner by the state, which translates to roughly $900. And what was this fine for? Did he physically assault someone? Did he steal? No. He was fined by the government for calling his own daughter princess and for describing his ex-girlfriend as emotional.
And here's the kicker. He didn't post this on a billboard or shout it in a town square. He used these words in a private text message.
Right. The state literally reached into a private, interpersonal communication, extracted words that are entirely benign in any historical context, and criminalized them.
But what makes this a true satanic inversion in Riker's eyes is how he contrasts that father's punishment with the treatment of the ex-wife in the exact same scenario.
According to the text, while the father is being financially penalized for using the word emotional, the mother, who actually initiated the destruction of the family, is rewarded by the state. The book claims she left him and the children, and then proceeded to collect full child support, housing benefits, and mental health subsidies from the government, all while actively dating multiple younger men.
And the father ultimately lost custody.
Yes, and Riker emphasizes that he didn't lose custody because he was demonstrably unfit or abusive in any traditional sense. He lost custody because the Swedish family courts operate on a default, inverted assumption. Men are inherent risks, and women are inherent victims, regardless of the actual behavior of the individuals involved.
Riker uses the Swedish court case as a microcosm for a much larger phenomenon he calls institutional capture. He claims that our foundational institutions, our schools, our legal courts, our mainstream media, and corporate HR departments were originally designed and built by men to uphold objective justice, merit, and productivity. But over the last several decades, they have been quietly and systematically hijacked by a gynocentric ideology.
And to understand how this capture actually functions day to day, Riker introduces a psychological framework he calls the infant predator schema. This is absolutely vital to understanding his worldview. He says this schema is the cognitive virus that has infected every single policy, law, and agency in the Western world.
Let's break down how the infant predator schema works, because it really clarifies his perspective on modern gender relations. In this framework, the captured institutions treat adult women as perpetual infants, meaning women are viewed by the state and the corporation as incredibly fragile, inherently pure, entirely devoid of malicious agency, and in constant need of protection, unearned resources, and emotional validation.
Think about how that plays out. If a woman makes a mistake, the system looks for the external factor that caused it. She was stressed, she was manipulated, she was oppressed by the patriarchy. She is never granted the agency of a fully responsible adult who simply made a bad choice. She is treated with the velvet gloves you would use for a toddler.
Exactly. And the other half of the schema is how institutions view men. If women are default infants, men are cast in the role of default predators. Men are viewed as strong, yes, but inherently dangerous and morally corrupted. Because of this default assumption of guilt and danger, the system believes men require constant surveillance, immediate control, harsh punishment for minor infractions, and eventually total elimination from any sphere of cultural influence.
So under the infant predator schema, if a man and a woman have a conflict, whether it's a divorce proceeding, a workplace dispute, or an argument on a college campus, The institution does not look at the objective facts of the case first. It looks at the genders. The woman is automatically slotted into the infant victim category requiring protection, and the man is automatically slotted into the predator-aggressor category requiring neutralization. Riker argues this is why you see such wildly disproportionate reactions to male and female behavior in our society.
Yeah. And this leads us to a fascinating question. If the system is treating everyone like children who need to be managed, where's that impulse coming from? Who is actually running these captured institutions? This is where Riker introduces his theory of the maternal archetype hijack.
I found this section incredibly compelling from a sociological perspective. Riker posits that as modern women delay or entirely reject biological motherhood driven by career ambitions or feminist ideology, their innate biological nurturing instincts do not just magically disappear. You cannot just turn off millions of years of evolutionary wiring. Instead, he argues, those maternal instincts metastasize.
He cites evolutionary psychologists like David Buss to build the argument that women possess a deep-seated biological drive to nurture, to protect, and to manage a family unit. When a woman is not raising children of her own, that immense reservoir of instinctual energy gets redirected into collectivist tribalism. Riker claims that childless women in positions of power essentially turn the state, or the massive multinational corporation, into a universal mother.
And this universal mother is not the warm baking cookies kind of mother. It is the overbearing, hyper-anxious, paternalistic mother. He argues that these institutions become obsessed with safetyism, controlling behavior, and eager to treat adult citizens exactly like toddlers who need to be told what to say, what to eat, and how to behave.
He actually brings hard data to the table to support this behavioral shift. He cites a 2023 study out of Stanford University that looked at leadership demographics in government bureaucracies. According to the text, the study found that government agencies with female majority leadership are 42% more likely to implement highly paternalistic regulations. We are talking about outright bans on behaviors, strict mandates, and excessive warning labels, rather than using merit-based incentives or trusting the public to make their own choices.
Riker's interpretation of that data is brutal. He says, these aren't rational policies made by stoic leaders who understand risk assessment and personal responsibility. He claims these are the neurotic edicts of women who never wanted to be mothers in their private lives, so they subconsciously turned the entire apparatus of the state into a surrogate child they can dominate and control.
But how does this control actually enforce itself on a day-to-day basis? It is not always through loud public laws passed in Congress. More often than not, it is enforced through a covert social mechanism that Riker calls GSR, which stands for gossip, shaming, and rallying.
This was a massive part of his argument, and is something I think every listener has probably witnessed or experienced at some point. Riker identifies GSR as the primary historical female weapon for social control. He says it operates invisibly. He uses this great analogy where he calls it a fungal mycelium network, running just beneath the surface of society, quietly poisoning the roots of truth and merit before they can even sprout.
It is a brilliant analogy for how whisper campaigns work. He describes GSR as a low-cost, incredibly high-impact weapon system deployed almost exclusively by women. Think about the mechanics of it. It starts with the G-gossip. The goal of gossip is to spread an infection of doubt. It is never a direct factual accusation. It is vague. It is someone saying a male colleague's energy feels off, or that his communication style is intimidating, or that he makes people uncomfortable.
Right, there's nothing tangible to defend yourself against. You can't prove that your energy isn't off. Once the gossip has infected the social group, the S kicks in shaming. The group begins to socially isolate the target. People stop inviting him to meetings. They stop replying to his emails. They give him the cold shoulder in the break room. The target is suddenly a pariah, and he usually has no idea why.
And then comes the final, lethal blow, the R rallying. This is the mobilization of the collective immune response. The group, having established that the target is a predator through gossip and shaming, rallies to destroy his career or his reputation entirely. And the terrifying part, according to Riker, is that this entire execution happens without a single shred of due process, without any formal presentation of evidence, and without any burden of proof. It is pure, unfiltered mob rule.
To back up the assertion that this is a distinctly female behavioral pattern, the text leans on a University of Oxford study. This study claims that women, on average, gossip 3 times more often than men do. But more importantly, it analyzes the nature of that gossip. The study found that 78% of female gossip is heavily evaluative, meaning it is focused on judging someone's character, their moral worthiness, and enforcing tribal norms. It is not just sharing informational facts like, hey, did you hear the copy machine is broken? It is weaponized social currency.
Riker directly links this GSR mechanism to massive modern phenomena like cancel culture and the Me Too movement. He views these not as noble pursuits of justice, but as digitized, globalized mob rule powered entirely by gossip, shaming, and rallying. He cites a staggering report from the Wall Street Journal claiming that 87% of men named in public Me Too allegations were never actually charged with a single crime. No police investigation, no trial, no conviction, yet their careers, their families, and their public lives were absolutely vaporized by this digitized gossip cascade.
Think about the last time a vague rumor circulated at your office. Riker isn't just saying that's an example of bad workplace culture. He is arguing it is a specific, highly evolved, weaponized system designed specifically to bypass the male-built systems of formal evidence and objective truth. He argues that modern diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives, are essentially the formal institutionalization of this GSR triad.
He claims that corporate HR departments, which are overwhelmingly dominated by female employees, have essentially become processing centers for whispered complaints. In Riker's view, HR does not exist to protect the company or find the objective truth, it exists to validate female feelings. He says the modern workplace has been transformed into a matriarchal temple where successful, productive men are routinely offered up as ritual sacrifices to appease the collective anxiety of the female hive mind.
And this transition from objective truth to validating feelings leads us perfectly into one of the most intellectually dense sections of the book. Riker takes this concept of social control and applies it to language and truth itself, in a section he calls Epistemic Violence and the War on Truth.
Let's pause on the term epistemic violence because that is a very heavy academic concept, but it is crucial to his thesis. Epistemology is the branch of philosophy concerned with knowledge. It is simply how we know what is true. How do we determine reality? Riker is arguing that the actual tools we have historically used to find the truth, things like raw data, the scientific method, empirical evidence, and objective merit, are being systematically stripped away and destroyed.
It's like trying to build a house, but someone tells you that using a tape measure is a form of oppression, so you are only allowed to guess the length of the wooden boards based on how you personally feel about them. That is the exact inversion he is talking about. He claims that language has been so thoroughly weaponized that basic objective terms like merit, logic, excellence, and objectivity are now officially tagged by elite academic institutions as patriarchal constructs designed to keep marginalized people down.
To illustrate how dangerous this is in practice, he shares an incredible, chilling anecdote about a male software engineer at Google. According to the text, this engineer was fired very publicly and very aggressively. But what was his offense? He didn't harass anyone, he didn't use a slur, he simply cited peer-reviewed mainstream scientific studies on biological sex differences regarding occupational preferences. He wrote an internal memo suggesting that innate biological differences in male and female brains might partially explain why fewer women choose to pursue high-stress coding jobs and why more women gravitate toward people-oriented professions.
And what was the institution's response? Human Resources didn't bring competing scientists to dispute his data. They didn't point out flaws in his methodology. Instead, they claimed that the very act of speaking his truth created a hostile work environment and made his female colleagues feel unsafe.
And that perfectly encapsulates Riker's point about what he calls the religion of feelings. He argues that in this inverted reality, lived experience and subjective emotional states have completely usurped objective data. The truth no longer matters. The emotional reaction to the truth is all that matters. He calls this the hurt equals harm fallacy. If a woman feels oppressed by a man's entirely neutral, fact-based email, then the institution decrees that the email is objectively oppressive, regardless of its actual verifiable content.
It is a terrifying standard because it is entirely subjective. There is no defense against someone else's feelings. He gives another devastating example of this playing out on a college campus. There was a male engineering student at UC Santa Barbara. This student was in a private group chat with a few friends, and he made an off-color joke about the gender ratio in his upper-level math class. He typed something along the lines of, there are 30 guys for every girl in this class, someone's going to get lucky.
Now, was it a crass joke? Sure. Was it a public declaration or a threat? Absolutely not. But according to Riker's account, a female classmate gained access to this private chat. Within 72 hours, the student's name, face, and location were doxed on Instagram. He was immediately suspended by the university administration pending an investigation, and the sheer stress of the mob descending on him caused him to be hospitalized with a severe panic attack.
Riker points out the absolute insanity of the institutional response here. No university policy was actually broken. No physical harassment occurred. No one was threatened. But this young man's life, his academic career, and his mental health were completely turned upside down by biological warfare waged through social media. And the university, the institution supposed to protect due process, immediately sided with the mob because the mob claimed they felt unsafe.
What's truly fascinating is how Riker traces the origins of this hypersensitivity back to early childhood education. He doesn't think this starts in college or in corporate HR. He believes it is baked into boys from the moment they enter kindergarten through a system he terms pedagogical gynocentrism.
This part of the deep dive really resonated with a lot of what we see in the news about boys falling behind in school. Riker argues that the entire physical and psychological architecture of modern schools has been redesigned specifically to pathologize normal boyhood.
He looks at the biological realities of young boys. Boys' brains and bodies thrive on constant movement, physical risk-taking, competition, and spatial reasoning. But what does the modern gynocentric classroom demand? It demands absolute stillness, passivity, quiet compliance, and constant verbal and emotional processing.
So when a 7-year-old boy acts like a normal 7-year-old boy, when he wants to wrestle, when he turns his pencil into an imaginary gun, when he competes fiercely with his friends, or simply can't sit perfectly still in a plastic chair for 6 hours a day, the system does not accommodate him. Instead, normal masculine behavior is immediately treated as a medical defect. He is sent to the school psychologist, he is diagnosed with ADHD, he is heavily medicated with amphetamines, and he is punished. Meanwhile, female socialization norms, sitting quietly, seeking consensus, processing feelings, are enforced as the universal gold standard for all human behavior.
And the demographics of the education system guarantee this outcome, according to Riker. He points out that female teachers outnumber male teachers by a staggering 7-to-1 ratio in elementary schools. He notes that since the year 2000, the overall number of male teachers has plummeted by 33%. Why? Because men are actively fleeing a toxic, hyper-regulated system that demonizes their natural masculine traits and constantly views them with suspicion under that infant-predator schema we talked about earlier.
So if this infant-predator dynamic, this suppression of male energy, starts in elementary school and continues through the university level, you have to ask, what happens when these heavily socialized kids grow up, enter the workforce, and get credit cards? That is where Riker takes aim at the economy, and he does not hold back. He introduces this concept of the consumer queen, and his economic analysis is absolutely blistering.
It really is. He details a series of economic claims that completely upend the traditional feminist narrative of economic oppression. Riker cites market research showing that women in the West allegedly control between 80 to 85% of all consumer spending. They make the vast majority of purchasing decisions for households. Yet, he points out, women contribute significantly less to the overall GDP in terms of raw economic production, infrastructure creation, and tax revenue compared to men. He provocatively labels this massive imbalance as a form of economic parasitism.
He goes directly after one of the most sacred cows of mainstream feminism, which is the pink tax. We've all heard of the pink tax, the idea that products marketed specifically to women, like pink razors or special shampoos, are unfairly priced higher than the male equivalents, and that this proves the market is rigged against women. Riker aggressively dismantles this. He argues the pink tax isn't systemic oppression, it is basic, fundamental supply and demand driven entirely by female consumer choices.
He argues that nobody is forcing women at gunpoint to buy a razor with a 40% markup just because it's pink. The market prices those items higher because women willingly choose to pay a premium for aesthetics and marketing. They choose to buy the $200 10-step skincare routine instead of a $5 bar of soap. Riker asserts that you cannot claim to be oppressed by a market that you almost entirely control with your own wallet.
And he contrasts this myth of the pink tax with his own very real concept, the blue tax. He asserts that while women are buying luxury skincare and aesthetic goods, men are burdened with the vast majority of the invisible cost that actually keeps society functioning. Men pay the lion's share of auto repair bills, home maintenance costs, life insurance premiums, and the costs of dating and courtship.
Riker uses this to launch a massive critique of what he sees as rampant female hedonistic spending. He brings up a highly viral story that perfectly encapsulates his point. There was a young woman who went viral on TikTok. She makes roughly $55,000 a year at a basic entry-level job. She openly admitted to having massive, crippling student loan debt and thousands of dollars in revolving credit card debt. Yet she proudly posted a video celebrating that she just leased a $12,000 Tesla, and she framed this horrific financial decision as an act of feminist empowerment and treating herself.
Riker notes the staggering statistic that women hold 68% of all consumer credit card debt in the United States. He argues that our culture has deeply inverted how we view financial responsibility. When women spiral into massive consumer debt for clothes, cars, and vacations, the culture frames it as necessary self-care. But if a man spends his money on tools, a project car, or a hobby, it is immediately labeled by his partner or the culture as toxic consumerism or financial abuse.
He extends this blistering economic critique directly into the corporate workplace with a concept he calls the slack subsidy. Riker is highly critical of the modern push for corporate flexibility things like permanent remote work, mental health days, unlimited paid time off, and flexible hours. He argues that these policies, while branded as universal benefits, are overwhelmingly utilized by female employees to drastically reduce their effort, avoid the pressures of the job, and prioritize their lifestyle over their productivity.
And who picks up the slack? The men. He shares a very specific, deeply illustrative example from the text that will make a lot of corporate listeners nod their heads. There's a story about a female senior attorney at a high-powered New York law firm. During the pandemic, she successfully negotiated to work entirely remotely from Tulum, Mexico. We've all seen those working from the beach Instagram posts. She posts about surfing in the morning, doing an hour of yoga, meditating on the beach, and casually billing her hours from a cabana.
But Riker forces us to look at the invisible side of that equation. Who is doing the actual heavy lifting while she is manifesting her best life in Tulum? Meanwhile, back in New York, her male colleague, a guy who is married with 3 kids and a mortgage, is working grueling 80-hour weeks. He is the one staying in the office until midnight to cover her client emergencies. He is the one handling the high-stress, late-night negotiations because she is offline for self-care. He is physically carrying the weight of her flexibility.
And what is the ultimate punchline of this story? The kicker that proves Riker's point about institutional inversion. When promotion time rolls around, the firm praises the female attorney for her innovative work-life balance and makes her a partner to boost their diversity metrics, while the male colleague who actually generated the firm's survival is passed over. He is just expected to keep grinding.
Riker uses this Tulum story to draw a very dark, stark conclusion about modern gender dynamics in the workforce. He believes that women fundamentally want the titles, the prestige, the corner office, and the massive paychecks of corporate power, but they absolutely refuse to accept the grueling responsibility, the crushing stress, and the personal sacrifice that actually builds and maintains that power. He claims they want to consume the infrastructure, leaving men to act as the silent, unappreciated, disposable infrastructure of society. Men build the roads, women just want to drive the luxury cars on them.
That concept of men as disposable infrastructure leads us right into what Riker considers the absolute most severe, catastrophic consequence of this gynocentric system. We are moving into his analysis of legal weaponization and what he ominously titles the death of fatherhood.
This section is where Riker relies most heavily on hard, institutional statistics to make his case that the state is actively at war with men. He points a massive spotlight at the family court system, citing claims that a staggering 96% of contested child custody battles end in favor of the mother. Let that number sink in. 96%. He attributes this near-total monopoly to a heavily skewed system where 73% of family court judges and administrative personnel are female.
He argues that these courts do not operate on the presumption of innocence or the best interest of the child. They operate entirely on the infant predator schema we discussed earlier. The mother enters the courtroom automatically clothed in the presumption of virtue and victimhood, while the father enters the courtroom carrying the default assumption of guilt, danger, and financial utility.
Riker doesn't even use the terms child support or alimony. He redefines them entirely, calling them financial conscription. He explores a massive, glaring cultural double standard regarding reproductive rights. We live in a society where women are culturally praised, fiercely protected by the law, and politically supported for choosing not to be mothers. If a woman wants an abortion or wants to surrender a child, it is celebrated as an exercise of bodily autonomy.
But Riker points out that if a man attempts to exercise any form of autonomy, if he attempts to opt out of fatherhood in cases of an accidental pregnancy, he is hunted down by the state, criminalized, and his wages are garnished by force. He even delves into the darkest corners of this issue, discussing the shocking reality of paternity fraud. He highlights cases where DNA testing conclusively proves that a man is not the biological father of a child, meaning the mother lied to him and cheated on him. Yet the inverted legal system still forces the defrauded man to pay child support for another man's child under the threat of prison time if he refuses.
To Riker, this proves that the state views men not as human beings with rights, but strictly as walking wallets, beasts of burden meant to be yoked to the plow of female reproductive choices. The erosion of the male presence in the family is the central, agonizing tragedy in Riker's entire worldview. He highlights a genuinely tragic statistic. There are currently over 24 million children in America waking up every single day in fatherless homes.
And he connects the dots between that statistic and the absolute collapse of civil order. He correlates fatherlessness directly to societal decay, noting that 70% of all juveniles currently sitting in state correctional facilities come from homes without a father. He looks at the skyrocketing rates of youth depression, anxiety, gang affiliation, and suicide, and he places the blame squarely on the systematic removal of the patriarch from the home.
And he fundamentally believes this removal isn't an accident or a natural sociological drift. He argues that our captured institutions actively and maliciously conspire to erase fathers from the cultural consciousness. Look at the media. When was the last time you saw a strong, competent, authoritative father figure in a television commercial or a sitcom? Dads are almost universally portrayed either as bumbling, incompetent clowns who can't figure out how to do laundry without their wife's help, or they are portrayed as dark, brooding, default abusers.
In schools, any form of traditional paternal discipline setting strict boundaries, demanding excellence, enforcing consequences, is immediately labeled by educators as toxic masculinity or borderline abuse. He even mentions an unbelievable anecdote about a public elementary school that literally canceled their annual Dad's Night event. The school board's justification. They stated that male presence introduces an element of risk and anxiety to the children, even if it is merely symbolic. They literally banned fathers from the property because maleness itself was deemed a biohazard.
Riker argues the ultimate goal of the captured state is to entirely replace the biological father. They want to turn the government into a giant bureaucratic sugar daddy that extracts tax resources from productive men by force, only to redistribute those resources to subsidize the chaotic choices of single motherhood, ensuring that women remain dependent on the state rather than on a husband.
We also need to briefly touch upon his highly controversial, deeply philosophical views on abortion and modern aesthetics, because he ties them directly into this narrative of civilizational decline. Riker doesn't view the abortion debate through the typical lens of healthcare or religion. He frames the modern abortion cult as a literal civilization suicide pact.
He claims that over 350 million children have been erased globally. But more importantly, he views this not as a tragedy of necessity, but as an ideological statement. He calls it the maternal rebellion hypothesis. He argues that modern women are using abortion as a narcissistic middle finger to nature itself, a violent rebellion against their own biological duty to propagate the species.
And he parallels this biological rebellion with what he calls the aesthetic rebellion. This is one of the most unique insights in the book. He critiques the massive, explosive rise in extreme cosmetic surgery. He isn't talking about a simple nose job. He is talking about the total grotesque transformation of the human form. He brings up a story of a Brazilian woman who took out 14 separate high-interest payday loans to fund her 17th elective cosmetic surgery.
Riker views this extreme surgical trend as a form of ideological demonic possession aimed at entirely erasing natural biological sexual dimorphism. He argues that by inflating their lips, restructuring their jaws, and implanting massive amounts of silicone into their bodies, women are intentionally turning the female form into an artificial, defunctionalized plastic project. They are declaring war on the very concept of natural beauty and natural function.
Okay, so after laying out this exhaustive, multi-layered, incredibly dark critique of modern society, where the courts are weaponized, the economy is parasitic, truth is dead, and the institutions are actively hostile to men, what is Riker's solution? How does he propose a man actually navigate this hostile landscape without losing his mind or ending up in prison?
This is where the book shifts from a diagnosis of a disease to a prescription for a cure. The final section of the book is titled Reclaiming Reality, the Path Back. And his very first major prescription for men is a hard pivot away from modern modes of communication. He argues that men must absolutely refuse to engage in the emotional, feeling-based, subjective arguments of modern feminism. You cannot win a game where the rules change based on how the other person feels. Instead, he says men need to put on ancient intellectual armor. Specifically, they need to return to the trivium.
I love that he goes all the way back to antiquity for this solution. For those who aren't familiar, the trivium is the foundational structure of classical education. It consists of 3 pillars: logic, rhetoric, and grammar. Riker says that modern men have been stripped of these tools, making them defenseless against emotional manipulation. He takes the trivium and applies it practically, almost like a martial art, to dismantle the most pervasive feminist slogans of our era.
Let's actually roleplay how he does this, because it is fascinating to watch him deconstruct these ideas. Let's take one of the most common cultural mantras of the last decade, the phrase, language is violence. When a university activist screams that a conservative speaker's language is violence, how does a man equipped with the trivium respond?
Riker says you start with logic. You expose the inherent fatal contradiction in the statement itself. If the statement, language is violence, is true, then the activist using that very sentence to attack you is, by their own definition, committing an act of violence against you. The premise eats its own tail. It is a logical impossibility.
Exactly. And then he moves to grammar. In classical education, grammar isn't just about where to put a comma, it is about the precise, objective definition of terms. Riker points out that feminist ideology relies entirely on vague, amorphous, undefined words like patriarchy, toxic, problematic, or creepy. These aren't analytical terms, they are thought-terminating cliches designed to shut down debate. He argues that if you simply force the opponent to rigorously define their terms, asking, "What exactly do you mean by toxic? Give me the empirical parameters of that word," the entire emotional framework collapses because it has no foundational substance.
He gives an incredible example of the power of this intellectual armor. He talks about a young man who used to be a deeply angry, bitter incel posting manifestos on Reddit. This kid was consumed by rage at women and society. But then he discovered classical philosophy. He read Aristotle. He learned formal logic and how to structure a syllogism. And Riker says this completely turned the young man's life around. Why? Because the young man realized that feminism wasn't some invincible, terrifying truth that he had to be angry at. It was just incredibly bad, flawed logic dressed up in hysterical emotion. Once he saw the mathematical flaws in their arguments, he stopped being angry and just started laughing at it, completely removed the power it had over him.
But Riker knows that intellectual defense is only half the battle. You can win the argument in your mind, but the family courts can still garnish your wages and HR can still fire you. So beyond mental fortresses, Riker points to a physical and societal withdrawal. He dedicates a massive portion of the conclusion to discussing the movement of going Gulf, referencing Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, which in the modern era is known as MGTOW, or Men Going Their Own Way.
MGTOW is a massive, incredibly significant, and often misunderstood part of the modern manosphere. Mainstream media usually portrays these men as pathetic, angry losers who can't get a date, so they retreat to their parents' basements to hate women online. But Riker frames it entirely differently. He observes that these are often highly successful, intelligent men who are simply looking at the objective statistics and making a calculated risk assessment.
Think about it like a businessman evaluating a contract. Riker says these men look at the 70% divorce initiation rate by women. They look at the 96% custody loss rate in family courts. They look at the constant threat of a career-ending Me Too accusation in the HR department. And they are logically, rationally choosing to walk away from the table. They are opting out of marriage entirely. They are withdrawing from corporate ambition because the corner office isn't worth the target on their back. They are minimizing their participation in a society that hates them.
Riker emphasizes over and over that he does not view this MGTOW phenomenon as a hateful retreat. It is not a temper tantrum. He frames it as a highly rational, almost mathematical survival strategy against a rigged casino. If the price of entry into marriage, fatherhood, or corporate leadership is absolute servitude, total loss of freedom, and the constant looming risk of sudden financial and social annihilation via a false accusation or a divorce decree, then the only logical winning move is to simply not play the game.
He calls the inevitable endgame of this mass male withdrawal the gynocentric implosion. Riker prophesies that society will eventually hit a wall when enough highly competent, productive men finally cut off the supply of their labor, their tax dollars, their protection, and their utility. The female demand for endless resources and safety will have nothing left to extract from. The infrastructure will crumble because the men who built it and maintained it have quietly walked off the job.
It is a stark, absolute, and frankly terrifying vision of complete cultural separation. Riker firmly believes that until the gynocentric system is starved of resources and forced to face the brutal, real-world consequences of this male withdrawal, there can be no negotiation, no compromise, and no rebuilding of healthy, balanced institutions.
So, to synthesize and summarize this incredibly heavy, incredibly deep dive, we have spent the last hour meticulously exploring Conrad Riker's exhaustive, highly polarizing, and deeply provocative blueprint of modern societal collapse. We have examined his core thesis that our institutions have been entirely inverted by a gynocentric, feeling-based ideology. We've traced his intense arguments from the weaponization of the Swedish family courts and corporate HR whisper campaigns to the staggering economic parasitism of the modern consumer lifestyle, all the way down to the psychological suppression of the natural maternal archetype.
It is an absolute sweeping systemic critique of everything we accept as normal in the modern West. And again, I want to reiterate to you, our listener, the explicit purpose of this deep dive. Our goal today was to objectively unpack this deeply challenging source material. We wanted to provide you with a clear, structured, and unflinching window into this specific manosphere and men's rights framework. Whether you agree with a single word Riker wrote, or whether you find his worldview entirely repugnant, you need to understand the arguments that are driving a massive, significant, and rapidly growing cultural movement among young men today.
Understanding the architecture of an ideology is the only way to actually engage with it in the real world.
Exactly. And as we wrap up, we want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you go about the rest of your day. We are currently living in a cultural landscape where men and women are increasingly consuming entirely different media realities. They are being fed different algorithms, and they are beginning to operate from fundamentally opposed, highly tribal ideological frameworks, like the intense, absolute scorched earth framework presented in this book. If men and women no longer even agree on the basic definitions of words like truth, justice, or merit, how does a society ever go about rebuilding a shared language of trust? Or is the catastrophic civilizational fracture that Conrad Riker describes in this book simply inevitable at this point? Have we already passed the point of no return?
That might be the most critical existential question for the future of our entire social fabric.
It really is. It is something we all need to think deeply about. Remember, if you want to dive into the original text yourself, to explore these arguments firsthand, to see his footnotes and his data, go buy the ebook right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. The title, again, is Feminist Logic Bomb, Suffragette Terrorism, Epistemic Violence, Misandry Without Borders, Satanic Inversions, and Ideological Negative Animist Possession. And be sure to follow the author, Conrad Riker, at Conrad Riker at his Substack for more of his ongoing work. Finally, before you close the app, please hit that like button and subscribe to this show. It helps us out immensely, it beats the algorithm, and it ensures that we can keep bringing you these massive, unfiltered deep dives into the most fascinating, challenging, and important sources out there. Thank you so much for exploring this with us. We will see you on the next deep dive.